Stand-up comedy is the personification of science.
Thank you. Good night. My name is Harold.
Hello, my name is Dr. Harold Bays, Medical Director and President of the Louisville Metabolic and Atherosclerosis Research Center located in Louisville, Kentucky. Welcome to this series of YouTube videos entitled The Science of Stand-Up. In this series of YouTube videos, we are exploring the interrelationship between the science of stand-up comedy and other sciences. In this particular YouTube video, we will be covering racism. In prior YouTube videos, we examined how it is that the science of stand-up integrated with theoretical physics. And we also went through the intersection of the science of stand-up with 50 common literary devices. And more recently, we demonstrated the integration of the science of stand-up with the sciences of psychology and psychiatry. So for this particular YouTube video, as well as the next two YouTube videos, we will be exploring the social sciences. This YouTube video is on racism, and then the next one will be on free speech and cancel culture. And then the one after that will be discussing forgiveness and implementation of the safe age. So you're not going to want to miss that. Before we get started, I'd like to give some disclosure. And the disclosure is that for those of you who are easily triggered when you encounter people with whom you disagree, just stop watching this right now, okay? Because I am next to certain that there are going to be some things that I'm going to say that you're going to disagree. And if that tends to upset you, then I want to encourage you to stop watching this now. That would be in all of our interests, okay? Second disclosure would be on the matter of race. There are going to be aspects of this particular video that I will not be objective, and I'll try to disclose that before specific sections. In other words, many of the other sections when we talked about science and the integration of the science of stand-up with other sciences, I've tried to be objective and stick to the science. But there are aspects of this particular video where that's not going to happen. And again, I will try to disclose that. All right, so let's talk about racism and stand-up comedy. Here's a review that was done on stand-up comedy among black comics. And this is sort of a romantic article, at least to me. First paragraph here that I'm citing. In the 1960s, prominent and successful black comedians used humor to address a wide array of issues that minority groups faced, such as racism, family, community, and politics. I mean, isn't that the promise of comedy? That's great. Okay, that's great. And then this last paragraph is so beautiful. Again, idealistic. I'm not sure it really achieved all that is said here, but again, you can't criticize the intent. Humor gave comedians a source of power, reversed stereotypes by making fun of those very stereotypes that degraded them, and revealed to the world that blacks were more than just the images they have been portrayed in popular culture. Their gifts led to the integration of audiences and allowed whites and blacks to develop a community of laughter and a mutual understanding of everyday struggles. Again, I don't know that black comics in the 60s and 70s and such reversed stereotypes, but to the extent that this was the promise, this is a beautiful thing. So right at the beginning, I'd like to cite what I think was aspirational in the 1960s. This is from Martin Luther King, a black activist at the time. And this was the I have a dream speech, very inspirational and just a sentinel moment in civil rights. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. And when this happens, and when we allow freedom to ring, then all of us will join hands and sing the words of the old Negro spiritual. Free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last. And that, again, that was the promise. That was the aspiration. I don't know that everyone finds this to be the aspiration anymore. And I find that to be both disturbing and disappointing. So let's go with what you commonly hear on the TV cable news shows, the opinion news shows. We need to have a national conversation about race. I don't know, folks. I think rather than talking about problems all the time, I think the time is past due. We ought to just start fixing them. And that's going to be an overriding theme in this particular video. Look, I don't mind that we talk about it, and I think that's great. I don't mind that we discuss it, and I think that's great. But every once in a while, why don't we fix the problems rather than talk about the problems? I'm a small business person. I'm an endocrinologist. I did stand-up comedy for 10 years. Getting things done is my nature, and the only way I know how to move things forward. So here's some quotes. Systemic racism does not exist. Well, let's talk about it. So there's a situation where I think we could have a conversation. Or systemic racism does exist. Well, let's have that conversation. So I agree with that. But if you have folks that say things like, I hate black people and wish them harm, well, folks, that's just racist hate speech. And I don't need to have that conversation. Or I hate white people and wish them harm. Yet again, that's racist hate speech. I don't need to be having that conversation. I don't know that it is resource effective to have conversations like this, because the amount of resources you would have to invest to turn those things around, very labor intensive. I think time might be better spent somewhere else, somewhere where you could have more of an impact and actually solve problems. It's like, I know some people have fascination about serial killers or serial rapists. And, they want to understand the criminal mind. Folks, I have no interest in understanding the criminal minds. I don't need to understand evil. Not important to me. Okay? Don't need to know. Okay? I just need for the problem to be fixed. So many times in comedy, what you do is you set up a premise and then you have a punchline. Okay? That's the way comedy, stand-up comedy usually works. Not doing that. Not in this YouTube video. I'm going to tell you the punchline right from the beginning. Many of you are probably wondering, does this guy believe systemic racism exists or not? Folks, based upon the science, I believe systemic racism does exist. And I'm not saying that based upon my opinion, although that is my opinion, and it is my personal experience, but I also have the data to back it up. And here you can see articles in the medical literature to support that indeed systemic racism does exist. So what are the historic events that have caused systemic racism and certainly brought systemic racism to the forefront? Well, I can't think of any better example of just an atrocity than the Tuskegee syphilis study. And I think most everybody knows this. Certainly our patients that participate in clinical trials know this. They may not know much about the practice of medicine or biology or chemistry, but boy, you talk about the Tuskegee syphilis study, and many of our black patients, they're historians, man, and they can be pretty granular in their description of the Tuskegee syphilis study. So what is this Tuskegee syphilis study? Just so we're on the same page, in the 1930s, 1970s, in collaboration with the Tuskegee Institute, black men with syphilis were enrolled in a study where many were left untreated until their death, without adequate informed consent, and even after the discovery of the curative penicillin. Wow, many of them went on to develop secondary and tertiary syphilis and horrible complications, and until the 1970s, this study was supported by the CDC and major mainstream medical societies. Well, that's just terrible. What a horrible thing. Then on the flip side, we have George Washington Carver, who was also at Tuskegee, a professor at Tuskegee. And I've looked everywhere. It looks like he was a professor at the same time the Tuskegee syphilis study was ongoing. Don't think he would have had any connection, but do find it interesting. So George Washington Carver was born into slavery. He was a professor at Tuskegee Institute. And in 1941, Time magazine suggested that George Washington Carver was the Black Leonardo, because he just did so much to advance science. He's the innovator of crop rotation and scientific exploration of peanuts and plant genetics. And I know a lot of people say, well, plant genetics, crop rotation. Folks, without the advancement of this sort of science, we don't live on this planet, right? Our life on this planet is very different if we're not able to grow enough crops in order to feed folks. So that's pretty important. And he has these quotes, and again, I'm a small business person, the kind of person who wants to get things done as such, and George Washington Carver, man, education is the key to unlock the golden door of freedom. I mean, are you going to dispute that? 99% of failure comes from people who have the habit of making excuses. Oh, man. Harsh, but absolutely true. Okay, but absolutely true. Zephytal, he could have added fortune to fame, but cared for neither. He found happiness and honor in being helpful to the world. Where are these folks nowadays? And here's the last one. And this is going to be important later on, which is why I'm bringing it up now. Learn to do common things uncommonly well. We must always keep in mind that anything that helps fill the dinner pail is valuable. Boy, I can't think of a more important or a more sentinel piece of advice for success. Learn to do common things uncommonly well. And we must always keep in mind that anything that helps fill the dinner pail is valuable. I want you to remember that. So as a research site, what did we have to do in order to ensure that many of the patients in the surrounding Louisville area felt comfortable coming to our research site? And I'm talking about black patients. What did we do that was so magical that now we have so many patients entering our clinical trials that are black? What did we do? Is it a mystery? Okay. Did I hire a public relations firm? No. I followed the 3 C's of addressing systemic racism in research. Not complicated. And that will be another underlying theme throughout this entire video, is that, folks, a lot of the solutions, not complicated. Actually very simple. That doesn't mean they're not hard. They're hard to implement, but the solutions are there, and they are relatively simple. First is provide good care. It may seem simple, but folks, if you're not competent, you're not going to attract white folks. You're not going to attract black folks. I mean, you can dress it up all you want, but at the end of the day, you got to provide good care. You got to be competent, and that applies to all races. Okay, so you just got to keep your eye on the ball on that one. Secondly, compassion. You got to show people compassion, that you really want to help folks, all folks, no matter their race. And then finally, chronology, time. And for us, it just took a few years, where we started out, didn't have very many black folks participating in our clinical trial. Again, the residual concern with regard to the Tuskegee syphilis study and such. But, over time, we built the trust through competence and compassion. And now we enroll 25% or more of our patients in clinical trials, blacks. Okay, So what's the great debate in 2021? Well, it seems to me that we have two competing theories here. One is that black folks just play the victim card too much, just too much victimization, and it's not really that way. If black folks would just stop trying to be victims all the time, things would get better. And then on the flip side, you have a lot of folks saying, well, it's all about white privilege. If people just understand that just simply by being white, you're privileged, and if people would understand that, then things would all get all better. My sense of it is, hopefully people are thinking these things not just for name calling, but because they genuinely think these positions are going to help people. And so you would think, well, why don't we look to academia and see if they're right? Well, that's a problem, because in academia we have medical disorders where you have societies and such that they are supportive of people who have disease, and they have advocacy for people who have disease. But for medical disorders, they also apply the scientific method, and they also have peer review, where there's diversity of thought. And then whatever solution is proposed, it's evidence-based, based upon the evidence. It's evidence-based. It's been studied, been evaluated objectively with statistical analyses and these types of things, so you can have confidence that whatever solution you came up with, or whatever treatment you came up with, it actually works. But for societal disorders, in academia, at least in the medical field, there is definitely support for, say, minority rights and such, and advocacy. We certainly see that. But then not so much the scientific method, as far as I can tell. And I'm a clinical researcher. I've been an investigator for over 500 clinical trials, spanning 30 years. And then as far as peer review and encouraging diversity of thought, not so much. If you have an opinion that is divergent from a leadership of a particular medical society, I don't know. I'm not sure how much, it's not like the peer review you get when you submit an article to a journal, and then people, you're blinded. You don't know who it is that's commenting on your submission and such, and so they feel free to give their opinion. I don't think people are very free to give their opinion when it comes to societal problems. And then as far as evidence-based solutions, yet again, I wish we would do more of that. And again, I applaud medical organizations for providing support, being advocates, and I think that's great. I just wish we would spend more time on solutions. Because to me, systemic problems require systemic solutions. And when I mean by solutions, it's way, way more than simply symbolism or cancellation of people for which a society disagrees, or demanding resignation from people for which the society disagrees. I don't see that as solving anything. Okay, it may be sweeping it under the rug, but it's not really a definitive solution. Now, you may say that I'm a bit extreme with regard to just wanting to get things done, and I think my staff would agree with you. Here is a slide that I've showed for over 20 years at our biannual staff meetings. This is our research site, Elmark Research Center. We all succeed only if we all succeed. And we just got to get stuff done. And I'm not particularly interested in blame. That's not really my focus. Now, look, if somebody does something so egregious that they need to be fired, then they're going to be fired. I mean, it doesn't happen very often, but you got to do what you got to do. But other than that, I'm just focused on getting things done, getting things fixed. And what I don't want to hear, these are unproductive responses. I'm new, I'm too busy, it's not my job, it's not my fault, it's beyond my control, it's not my responsibility, everybody makes mistakes. I'm not perfect, I'm only human, I'm working as hard as I can, other people did worse. Or, let me tell you about my personal problems and medical conditions to justify why I haven't gotten what you need done. I don't like to hear any of these things. I just want to hear it got done. So let's see how that might apply to racial disparities. Now, here's some racial disparity metrics. This is, I'll just say for blacks, for this particular discussion. And I picked out 6 metrics. Now, these aren't the only metrics. These may not even be the top 6 metrics. But I think they're pretty important metrics. Safety, life expectancy, family structure, education, income, and incarceration. So here's just 6 things. Here's 6 metrics. So why don't we do scientific testing in order to determine the most effective approach to racial disparities? And what we would do, if we were going to apply the scientific method, is we would have these cohort studies where we would find one area of one city and one area of maybe the same city or a different city and another area of a same city or a different city. But as long as they were relatively matched with regard to race and income and education, those types of things, just well matched, okay, well matched. And in one of the arms, we would test white privilege training. Okay, so everybody in that area would be trained on white privilege. And then in cohort number 2, we would have everyone undergo victimhood deprogramming. So for people who say that the main issue is always playing the race card, we would try to deprogram that. And then as a third arm, we would have a strategy of cooperation, prioritization, and mutual respect with implementation of evidence-based solutions, accountability, and avoidance of name-calling. And then, after a series of, say, 1 to 2 years, we would look at these metrics and we could see if one or any of them got better. And then we would know. And then what we could do is we could take that solution and just post it on the internet or publish it in a journal and encourage leaders, city leaders, to say, okay, here's one model that seems to work in this particular demographic. Why don't you think about implementing that? It's a solution. So why don't we think about implementing evidence-based solutions? And we would know because we would be testing it. But that's not how we do things. What we do now is we implement policies and such based upon what we think is the best thing to do without any evidence. Okay, so we just go making these policy changes, don't have any evidence to support it, but it makes us feel better, so we're going to implement them. Well, here's just an example of a couple of solutions that were proposed and actually implemented, sort of backfired because they weren't tested. Here in 1991 was a luxury tax, where there was a 10% U.S. tax on yachts and other things that people said, well, this is only rich people, so we're going to tax them, we're going to take that money and do other stuff with it. Great. But nobody thought about the downstream effects. And what happened is that people failed to understand that, yes, it was the rich people that were buying the yachts, but it was the middle class people who were making the yachts. So when the rich folks stopped buying the yachts, either because they didn't want to pay that kind of price for it, or they didn't want to be felt guilty, and people quit buying yachts, a bunch of people lost their jobs. So in 1993, the yacht tax was repealed because of the loss of jobs. So what might have been better would have been to say, look, why don't we test this out first and see if it actually generates the money we think it will, and make sure it doesn't have any adverse effects. That's how we do drug trials. Right? We don't just say we're going to make this drug and it seems like it does good things, so we're going to approve it and then just unleash it upon the population. We don't do that. Why do we do that with societal manipulations? Why do we do that? Is that any less important? I don't think it is. Here's another example. So Mao Zedong in China, 1958-1962, implemented his Great Leap Forward that included the 4-Pest campaign. Mao Zedong did not like rats, flies, mosquitoes, and sparrows. He just thought they were disgusting. So it only made sense that you would have a greater quality of life if you would just eliminate or cancel these things. Eliminate or cancel the rats and the flies and mosquitoes and sparrows. So he did. Implemented a plan, pretty successful at it, but implementing this untested alteration in the ecosystem caused an increase in locusts, rice yields diminished, It's estimated from 15 to 45 million Chinese died due to starvation. Folks, why can't we implement scientific method towards societal intervention? Why don't we even consider that? And then when we start finding solutions that actually work, post them on the internet. And if you live in a city where you've got a problem for one of these evidence-based solutions could work, then you would demand that your leader choose evidence-based solutions, okay? So here's one for you, is racial privilege and victimhood. So we've talked about this tension now we have between people who talk about privilege, and other people talking about being a victim and such. Is it necessary to have privilege or victimhood for systemic racism? Is that required? Well, I can only speak for me, as I don't think it does. I was raised in Southern Kentucky. I used to hang out when I was in high school and college, used to hang out in trailer parks. I'd hang out at the Crescent Bowl, the bowling alley, because red pin bowling at midnight was like one of the three things you could do where I came from, that at night, one of the few things you could do without being incarcerated. So, that's where I hung out. Used to drive a 1978 Monte Carlo, had dented and rusted fenders. It had a rain roof. I mean, you've heard of moon roof where the sunlight comes through, and you've heard of sun roof where the sunlight comes through. Rain roof, I think you get the idea. The handle of the door did not work. My cassette player and car speakers were removed for me, okay, where the wires, when I moved to downtown Louisville, my car was broken into, and they ripped out my cassette player and my radio, and all the wires are hanging out, and I only bought retreads for my car, and had to change a lot of my own equipment. If you're from the South, you're born with the intrinsic ability to work on a motor. I would change my own oil and change my own alternator. Had a big pair of fuzzy dice on the mirror. I don't know why I did it, but I did. Big pair of fuzzy dice on this 1978 Monte Carlo, hung it around the mirror. My job as a busboy, cook, janitor, clerk, I don't recall having health insurance. And I was repeatedly pulled over by the police all the time. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I was pulled over by police, not because I did anything wrong, just I did janitor work. It was late at night. I guess the police had much to do except pull me over. I looked suspicious probably in my 1978 battleship that I drove around. Maybe that's what it was. Finally, when I moved to Louisville and got a nicer car that I bought from Budget Rent-A-Center, it was an okay car, but I still got pulled over. And one time I got pulled over, and they said, "You know why I'm pulling you over?" I'm like, "I have no idea." He says, "Well, several miles back, you didn't adequately turn on your blinker when you passed a truck." I'm like, "Wow, you're pulling me over for that?" He said, "Well, in that, and you have Jefferson County plates." What? So why would you pull me over because I have Jefferson County plates? Because you people from Louisville, you just think you can do anything. So I was profiled based upon having Jefferson County plates. I was profiled based upon my county. Okay, so that's interesting. So I must say I still have a bit of fear when I see a police car. It's hard to wash that away. I would spend afternoons and nights playing basketball at city parks, church parking lots, candy stripes at college. And as I said, I spent my nights in trailer parks. I did a lot of fishing, spelunking, and red pin bowling. I played in street ball tournament, lived in a boarding house, $125 a month, no heat, no air conditioning. It was just a room attached to a bathroom. Rode the city bus, rode my bicycle to medical schools, shopped at Winn-Dixie for pot pies, 3 for 75 cents, and Tony's Pizzas. I lived around mice and cockroaches. And then I was a stand-up comic and musician. I could get into bars that way, and I didn't have to pay cover. And then I have served on academic diversity panels where they will have a woman, a black, a Hispanic, an Asian, and then me, because I'm the token South guy, okay? So what's the point of all this? The whole point is, does lower socioeconomic status define blackness? And the answer is no, right? I mean, you see my background. Does that make me black? No, it just doesn't. And on the flip side of this, if a person grew up in a better or a higher socioeconomic status than me, does that make them less black? And the answer is no. Now, I know some people disagree with that and say the only way that you can be black is to be at the lowest socioeconomic status. But folks, I just don't agree with that. I don't agree with that at all. Okay? And finally, what is privilege? Here's the one that gets me the most. What is privilege? How did I get into medical school? Well, at the time I was applying to medical school, they had this policy that the state legislature wanted to see more people from rural areas get accepted to the University of Louisville and the University of Kentucky, which was, University of Louisville was in Louisville, University in Kentucky is in Lexington. They were the two biggest cities, and yet they seemed to, all the people that got accepted seemed to be from those two cities. The Kentucky legislature said, we got to have more people accepted from rural areas. It can't just be from the bigger cities. So they implemented this policy where there was a preference given to people from rural areas to be accepted into the University of Louisville or the University of Kentucky Medical School. And I don't know the term for it. I should have looked it up before I did this video. I should have taken the time, but there's a word, and I can't think what it is, where it is that actions are taken in order to affirm a reduction in disparity. Okay? Don't know what that is. Don't recall the name for that, but there is definitely a word that describes when you want to affirm that you have taken action in order to reduce disparities. And that certainly would apply to me. That certainly would apply to me in how I got in early decision to the University of Louisville Medical School. What about victimhood? You say, oh, well, you had all this, you were from a lower socioeconomic status, so that would make you a victim. It does not make me a victim. Because I think there's a big difference from my situation, irrespective of my socioeconomic status and where I was going to go. I think the perception of where you are depends on where you see yourself going. And I think that's very important. That's an important aspect. Sometimes I don't think people understand enough. All right, so what if I had been black? Let's say I'd been black and everything. Folks, if I'd been black, my blood pressure would have been through the roof. Through the roof, okay? Because, first off, there would be the blatant racism, which would have driven me crazy, okay? And then secondly, there would be the perceived racism. And I would know that sometimes when people were doing things to annoy me, I would know that some of those times it's probably just because they're annoying people. But other times, how would I know that they were being annoying? Maybe it was because they were racist. I mean, I wouldn't know. So I would perceive it to be racist, but wouldn't be sure, but I'm not sure the feeling would be any different. And here's a quote that changed my life, because there have been so many times in my life where people have done just incredibly horrible things, and I think they're out to get me. I'm like, why are you out to get me? When in fact, they weren't out to get me. Here's the quote: never ascribe to malice that which is adequately explained by incompetence. Or another version, never ascribe to malice that which is adequately explained by indifference. Folks, for me, some of the things, some of the reasons why it is that I've been treated so poorly in business dealings and professional dealings and such, not so much because of malice, it's because people didn't care or they were incompetent. I mean, it's hard to understand that sometimes, and you have to step back, but I think that's right. But if I were black, I'm not sure how I could distinguish that. And then finally, there are a lot of times, we're going to talk about this, where there is racism and black folks don't even know it. They think they know it, but they don't. But I think they know that there are probably instances where there is discrimination and they don't know it. And yet again, I think that if I were black, that would cause my blood pressure to go through the roof. So whether it be blatant racism, perceived racism, or not perceived racism, just didn't know about it, that would significantly affect my blood pressure. All right. On the flip side, are all whites historically intrinsically racist? You hear that sometimes that, well, if you're white, then you're intrinsically racist. Not sure what that is meant to accomplish, to throw out those sort of pejoratives, but okay, let's go down that path. Deaths in the Civil War were over 600,000. The greatest number of deaths in any U.S. war, and it's not even close. Over 350,000 Union soldiers died, the vast majority being white. Okay? So to what degree should white Union soldiers be remembered for their ultimate sacrifice? To what degree was the U.S. Civil War about slavery? And to what degree does examination of slavery and the sacrifice of lives, black and white, during the Civil War, which was 1861, 1865, help craft solutions? And I would caution you to be very careful how you answer these questions. Because number one, to what degree should white Union soldiers be remembered for their ultimate sacrifice? They didn't sacrifice by writing a check. They sacrificed with their lives. Okay? I think that should be respected, right? So you might say, well, that was over 150 years ago. Really? Is that where you want to go? Slavery was over 150 years ago. I'm not sure that's where you want to go. To what degree was U.S. Civil War about slavery? Oh, it wasn't about slavery, and they probably sacrificed their lives because of some economic incentive and everything. Is that really the argument you want to make? That the Civil War really wasn't about slavery? Because if you do, a lot of white supremacists that would stand shoulder to shoulder with you and would want to break out their Confederate flags again, okay? And then finally, to what degree does examination of slavery and the sacrifice of lives during the Civil War help craft solutions? And I don't know that it does. Look, it happened. It's an atrocity. But at some point, folks, we've got to move forward and fix things. Got to fix it. And what are the experience? I don't want this to be just about black folks. I mean, what about Asians? Asians, there's been discrimination against Asians, and Asians seem to have assimilated pretty well to United States culture. What about Hispanics and Latinos? Again, been discrimination. And with regard to travel and such, I mean, the whole immigration issue, it's a topic in and of itself. What about Jewish folks? Who's been persecuted more than Jewish folks? Holocaust. Beyond that. And at the present time, when you talk about travel and such, I've done quite a bit of travel, done overseas travel, and I was stunned to learn there are places on the planet where Jewish folks can't go. There are places in the Middle East where if the passport says that they could potentially be Jewish or be from Israel, they can't go to certain Middle Eastern countries. I don't even hear that talked about. I learned this 10 plus years ago and whatever. There's all sorts of gymnastics people go through, like they will have their passport stamped on a separate page and not on their passport book if you're going to Israel. That way that'll allow you to go to certain Middle Eastern countries and such. What is that about? When you talk about Asians and Hispanics and blacks and such, I don't know any of them that can't travel to major parts of the world because of their race or ethnicity. Why are people talking about this? What about, and then finally, and I've talked about this before, and I'm just not going to let it go. I should, but I'm not. The whole issue about racism being predominantly problem in the South. I've talked about this in other YouTube videos. The beating of Rodney King, an historic event, was in Los Angeles, California. George Floyd was Minneapolis, Minnesota, not in the South. Okay. And isn't it interesting? 60% of blacks live in the South. Now, why do you think that is? Some southern states, the African Americans are 30% or more. Why do you think that is? And you say, well, yeah, but, look, compared to some of the northern states, the racism is far worse in the South than it is other places. Well, maybe because there are no blacks in some of the northern states. I mean, Maine or Vermont, African Americans are like 2%. Okay, what I'm saying is some southern states have 30% or more African Americans, so I'm not sure that's a fair comparison. And then, and then if that isn't condescending enough, you hear, well, it's because black folks like warmer weather. Really? So they're going to put their preference for warmer weather over blatant racism, being exposed to blatant racism. Does that make sense to anybody? See, I don't think it does. And plus, New Mexico, 3% African Americans. Arizona, 6% African Americans. Hawaii, 4% African Americans. These places aren't hot. See, I think they are. So I just think, again, too many times we just want to make these simple assumptions and such without actually examining the evidence. So why don't we go to the evidence? Let's do scientific testing on these theories that people have about how we can implement solutions. And then once we find solutions that actually work, let's post them on the internet. Let's make them prominent, and let's start implementing solutions and solve the problem. Now, you might want to say, well, Dr. Bays, you've been on a rant now for a little while. What does any of this have to do with stand-up comedy? Well, because there's a lot of stand-up comedy that has to do with racism or things like rednecks and such. Now, I think a lot of people don't really understand the term of rednecks. Redneck literally came from the fact that there are a lot of working class white persons in rural areas that got sunburn on the neck. And that's where it came from. I got to say, my experience also is, particularly times when there's harvest and such, that there can be plant irritants or contact dermatitis where working class white persons or farmers and such will rub their necks and it'll come in contact with some of the plant irritants that they had on their hands, and their necks will get really red, and just sunburn. Necks will get really red. And we used to be able to say that, just based upon demographics, there were a lot of black farmers, and at least culturally, they could be defined as also being rednecks, but you can't say that now because only less than 2% of farmers are African Americans, and that doesn't seem right to me. I just recently found this out, and I don't know why that bothers me, but people are free to do what they want, but that doesn't seem right. Okay, so again, when we're talking about comedy, first, I think people need to understand that a lot of individuals do not place race at the top of their daily concerns. I know that's going to annoy a lot of people, but that's reality. And when people do observe racism, they're sometimes reluctant to admit outrage because they don't know how that's going to fly with their peers and such. So that's when folks like me and other folks have the opportunity to bring these things up within the comedy club settings and say, look, it's okay to talk about this. Okay? So while the topic can be uncomfortable, comedy can be unique in granting permission for others to acknowledge truths such as social disparities and injustice. Folks, you can convey messages, be funny, but yet get a point across. That's when I think comedy is really good. I think that's when it's really good, is when we can send out a message and do so in a comedic way. Now, you are taking risks to the extent that maybe people don't agree with you, or you've crossed the line or whatever, but rewards are rarely risk-free.
People are stressed out. We just got over this Rodney King thing. Y'all stressed out about that? No? No. It's nice to have the Louisville Police Department here with us tonight. Yeah. What could you possibly do? Not going to be convicted, I don't guess. People are stressed out about it. Yeah, thank you. We've got 3 people over here. You're damn straight. Unbelievable. And then it went to trial. What happened? They were found innocent. And people upset about that. They said, well, how can you possibly explain that? Who do you blame for something like that? If you want to blame somebody for the results of that trial, blame the obvious source, and that is the inept attorneys who represented Rodney King. I mean, think about it. If you were armed with nothing more than that videotape, and you knew nothing about the law, and you had that tape, how could you possibly lose that trial? It's obvious. And I mean, did you see what they did? I'm not making this up. This is absolutely, people years from now are going to look back at this and say, that didn't happen. You're going, yes, it did. But when the trial went on, before the trial went on, these guys all got together and they said, okay, look, we have a black man being beaten to death by 4 white police officers, a potentially explosive racial issue. What should we do? How about getting an all-white jury? Yes. I think that's the best thing we ought to do to start with. And for a judge, how about David Duke? Is he available, folks? And then afterwards, what do we have? We had people out there protesting the violence, the useless violence, by killing over 55 innocent human beings. We had people out there who protested how the businesses have ignored the inner city by burning down the businesses of the inner city. And the only voice of reason through this entire melee was Rodney King himself. Got in front of the TV, told us all, he says, look, we got to learn to live together. We got to quit the killing. We got to stop it. Now, you got to respect him. You got to respect him for that. Another thing you got to respect him for is, the reason he was pulled over? Because he was driving 120 miles per hour through the streets of L.A. in a Hyundai. Folks, if you can drive 120 miles an hour in a Hyundai, not only should you be respected as a human being, but worshipped as some sort of a god. That's all I'm saying. That's all I'm saying. Folks, what is going on? The legal system's completely out of control. For example, what? Do we have any attorneys over here? Do we have an attorney over here? Are you an attorney? He's a policeman. Uh-oh. No, now there's nothing. Now, wait a minute. There's nothing wrong with this is not L.A. The people here are very friendly. Police officers, please, sir, get out of the car. I ain't getting out of the car. Please get out of the car. I'm begging you. Very nice. All right, police, it's a little different here, isn't it? Huh? You don't beat people with police batons, do you? No? Yes? No? No? Bribe them with donuts? Something like that? What is it? Got a cream field, come on. It's a cheap joke. It's a cheap shot, I'm sorry. No! It's a little bit...
Okay, so let's move on the matter of Uncle Tom. I write on here, I will not be objective. And in a way, that's really not right, because I think I am being objective, but many of you are probably not going to agree with me, so let's just say I'm not objective when I really think that I am being objective. Okay? So we talked about that. When is a black comic black enough? I've worked with a lot of black comics, and it's interesting how they go through these stages. I've worked with middle-class blacks that started out comedy and they did hardly any black material, and by the time towards the end of their career, they did almost all black material. And I think it had a lot to do with, that's where the jobs were. First off, if they didn't do a lot of black material, people would ask them, are you ashamed of being black, or how come you're not black enough, or whatever. They're like, well, what does that mean? I said, well, you're not going to be hired as much unless you do what we expect you to do, which is to be black. You're a black comic, so do black material. So they would gravitate towards black material. Sometimes do things with their hair and whatever. And again, I don't think that's right. I think people ought to have the freedom to do whatever kind of comedy they want to do. And if they wanted to do black material, that's fine, but they shouldn't have to. Nobody's ever come to me, and I'm half German. Nobody ever came to me and said, we'd love to hire you, but you're not doing enough German material. I mean, I don't know. All right, so let's talk about Uncle Tom. Who is Uncle Tom? So Uncle Tom is the title slave character in the book Uncle Tom's Cabin. Okay, it may have been based upon Josiah Henson, written by the abolitionist Harriet Beecher Stowe in 1952. I think most people know this. And this book successfully facilitated and mobilized moral outrage of whites against slavery, reportedly outsold the Bible. So this is a pretty important book. Okay. So who is Uncle Tom? Uncle Tom's a character, a dignified Christian man who was seeking freedom, but ultimately was whipped to death because he would not reveal the whereabouts of two runaway slave women who were hiding because they were sexually abused by their master. Okay? Think about that for a minute. As you think about how it is that you interpret Uncle Tom in the way that it is used today in society, is that really the caricature that you think fits? Well, no. The other thing is, just to show you how things evolve over time, and I'm saying this is a good thing, not a bad thing, you might want to look at the original lyrics to My Old Kentucky Home by Stephen Foster. I think, at least this website says, from Virginia, I guess the University of Virginia, poor Uncle Tom, good night. So My Old Kentucky Home, at least what I read, originated in deference to Uncle Tom's Cabin, or Uncle Tom. Now, if you were to read the lyrics now, you would say that's highly racist. What's wrong with you people from Kentucky? But as I will talk about later, folks, you can't be judging people today by what was standard or norm in the 30, 40, 50 years ago. Can't do that. All right, so here we have Uncle Tom. And when people use the term Uncle Tom, they often gravitate towards option B, is they perpetuate the pejorative based upon minstrel shows funded and performed by blatant racists. In other words, after the Civil War, there were these minstrel shows where people would go out, particularly in the South, and they would just mercilessly make fun of blacks, and they particularly made fun of Uncle Tom being feeble and weak and succumb to white folks and whatever. And they would do these shows, and people would laugh. And that's just an abomination. That's just an abomination. But on the other hand, if you look at option A is the historically accurate depiction of a person who sacrificed as a human slave in protection of his family. So when you use the term Uncle Tom, which definition are you honoring? Okay? Are you honoring the historically accurate sacrifices of humans trafficked and murdered as slaves? Or are you honoring and perpetuating the pejorative based upon minstrel shows funded and performed by blatant racists? Your choice. Okay? So that, I think a lot of blacks kind of know that and such, but here's one maybe they don't know. And this goes back to lack of perceived. Racism that's not perceived. I don't know how many black comics know what I'm about ready to say. Maybe they do. Maybe they do. Maybe they don't. So I was doing a job. There was a black comic on the stage and doing his routine. And I must say there's certain lines that people do that make me feel uncomfortable. There's one black comic that I worked with, nice guy, perfectly middle class, had a family. Just, again, really nice fellow. And his opening bit was he got up on stage. He was a headliner. He got up on stage and says, I'm glad to see you all out here tonight. And I guess you're probably glad to see me on the stage tonight, because if I'm on the stage, that means I'm not in the parking lot stealing your car. That was his opening line. That was about 30 years ago. Bugged me then, bugs me now. But I'm not being judgmental, because he's just out there making a living, folks. And he's out there doing the kind of material, or he was doing the kind of material that got him work. So I'm watching a stand-up comic who was black. I don't know if it was this guy or not. I don't remember. And the owner of the club comes up to me, sort of nods his head, and he goes, "Stepin Fetchit." He shakes his head. I'm like, "Yeah, Stepin Fetchit." I'm like, "I don't know what you're talking about." I don't know what Stepin Fetchit means. I don't know who it is. Well, I looked it up, and Stepin Fetchit was a vaudevillian and comedian, and it's the first black actor to have a successful film career. And if you look at the videos of Stepin Fetchit, I'm not sure that. I mean, many believe he portrayed unflattering black stereotype. And it was sort of pejorative describing certain black stand-up comics. Stepin Fetchit. So if you're a black comic and somebody has referred to you as Stepin Fetchit, that is not a compliment. And I don't know that a lot of black comics know that people are talking about them in that way, but that is a problem. And so that gets back to that quote that we talked earlier about George Washington Carver. Learn to do common things uncommonly well. We must always keep in mind that anything that helps fill the dinner pail is valuable. What does that mean? Folks, if doing the kind of black comedy that's expected is the way you take care of yourself and your family, I'm in no position to criticize. I may not like it. I may wish we lived in a world where that didn't have to happen, but I'm not going to be critical of it. Right? I'm not. And I'll let other people talk about Stepin Fetchit and all those other types of things. And until we live in the kind of a world where people can have the freedom to do the kind of comedy they want to do, the kind of stand-up they want to do, and still get paid, I don't know. I'm not going to be the one to be critical. So what is the systemic racism in comedy? Well, forced conformity, forced Stepin Fetchism, and lack of artistic freedom, and the idea that if a black comic did no black material, what would be the reaction of white folks, and what would be the reaction of black folks? I think it'd be tough. And that, to me, is an example. If you're talking about a video of the science of stand-up, that would be an example of systemic racism. It's just systemic racism in comedy. What about Black Panther? Okay, now stay with me, folks. In comedy bits, even comedy bits that have been written and performed by black comedy stand-ups, they will make jokes and such about how it is that African Americans or blacks sometimes set the bar way too high. You know, their expectations are way too high, and no matter what they get, it's never enough. So I don't see it that way. To me, I think there's many times where blacks have set the bar way too low. Let's talk about Black Panther. Okay, on the matter of Black Panther, this is a Marvel movie in 2018. Okay, so many blacks, when that movie came out, they're like, "Oh my gosh, we love this movie." It's one of the first superhero movies to have a predominantly black cast, with the protagonist being a black leader, portrayed in a positive role model. And Chadwick Boseman, which is, it's unfortunate he died as young as he did, but he was amazing. I mean, who couldn't support this guy? I mean, I supported him not just as an actor, but if you saw him interviewed or whatever, he just seemed like a good guy. When the reviews came in of Black Panther, amazing, defining moment, watershed, glorious. People were really jazzed about Black Panther. And, my perspective was, I just think this is an example of systemic racism because the bar was set so low. I mean, look, it's a good movie and everything. Let's talk some examples. Why was there not an all-black cast? 2013, a few years before that, Frozen was out. Disney movie did very well. It was in the fictional kingdom of Arendelle, which is in Norway, with a logical expectation of an all-European cast, all-white cast, which that's what it had, which I had no problems with that. Not a lot of blacks in Norway, okay? But here you had Black Panther was a derived Marvel movie in the fictional city of Wakanda, Africa, which you would think that there would be an all-African cast. But one of the major characters was Martin Freeman, who I love. Martin Freeman, he's Dr. John Watson in Sherlock Holmes with Benedict Cumberbatch, so he's really good there. But he was also a former hobbit. Now, folks, look, I like hobbits, or I think I would like hobbits. I've actually never met a hobbit, but I would like to think that if I met a hobbit, I would like a hobbit. I have nothing intrinsically against hobbits. But what is a former white hobbit doing in Black Panther? Why was that necessary? Number 2, why was vibranium characterized as a major reason Wakanda was technologically advanced? Right? That was the deciding factor, as this meteor came down and there was this fictional metal, vibranium, and this meteorite that absorbs, stores, and releases large amounts of kinetic energy. When it fell, and there was nobody who was going to know how to harness that. Well, what was the other property about vibranium that would cause the Wakanda technology to advance? Well, because vibranium is indestructible. It's really hard. So the reason why it is that Wakanda was technologically advanced wasn't because of their intrinsic abilities or their work ethic, their educational system. It's because vibranium is really hard. No, seriously, vibranium really hard. So that's the reason that Wakanda was so technologically advanced. It's because there was a meteorite that came down from the skies. Low bar. Why were Wakandan leaders chosen by who was not thrown off a cliff? I'm just not even going to talk about that. That's just, they couldn't have chosen their leaders based upon checkers or backgammon or chess or, beanbag or something. No, it's just whoever was not thrown off a cliff in hand-to-hand combat, that's who became their leader. Why were Black Panther rulers only able to obtain leadership superpowers by consuming a heart-shaped herbal hallucinogen supercharged by vibranium that serendipitously fell from the skies? Why was it based upon drugs? What's that all about? And who thought that was a good idea, to say that the only way that Black Panther rulers would obtain their leadership is through hallucinogens, drugs? Folks, I'm not here to cast aspersions or anything, but my goodness, if this had been called White Panther, at the end of the movie, what would have happened. At the end of the movie, they would have said, well, that stuff that you've been consuming, that's this heart-shaped herbal hallucinogen, doesn't have anything in it. It's placebo. It's just sugar, maybe got some cellulose, right? That's all it is. You had the power within you the whole time. Didn't have anything to do with the drug, had everything to do with you. All you had to do was click your slippers together and you could have been back home in Kansas, right? If it had been called White Panther, I suspect that's how the movie would have ended. And finally, this is the one that caused me to snap. So at the end of the movie, the Wakanda spacecraft uncloaked in an inner-city basketball court. Now, what would be the realistic expectation of inner-city black children upon encountering a decloaked spaceship? My guess is they would be running to their parents for protection, right? They would be scared because that's what children would naturally do. They would be frightened and they would go to their parents for protection. That would be their reaction. Not in Black Panther. Black Panther, their first reaction was to, this is a quote, when they're referring to the spaceship, okay? We can break it apart and sell it on eBay, unquote. They wanted to engage in destructive behavior and act as, chop shop, okay, as a local chop shop, steal the parts of this spaceship and then sell it on eBay, and steal it and then sell it on eBay. This is how people in Hollywood think black children should react, because, they're streetwise. They're streetwise. Just drove me crazy. Low bar. So what it says to me is that what would have been a reasonable medium bar for Black Panther? Just a medium bar, not a high bar, but a medium bar. How about an all-black cast? How about saying Wakanda technology advances were due to their superior educational system? How about saying Wakanda leaders were chosen on intellect and wisdom? How about saying Wakanda power was acquired by their humanity? And how about black children were portrayed as children? That would have been a medium bar. Here's another thing. NBA. You hear people railing about the NBA. People are not going to remember this, and they should, but they're not. In 2020, people didn't know what to do during the COVID-19 pandemic. They didn't know how we're going to get back to normalcy in our lives. So what did the NBA do? NBA being 75% black, the NBA says we're going to implement these policies and procedures, and we're going to do the playoffs and what they call the playoff bubble. And they demonstrated by science, by observation, by implementing a well-crafted and well-thought-out plan, they were able to have their playoffs and do very well and be able to complete the playoffs with minimal disruption due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And they showed everybody the way, and they led the way. So now people could go back to their normal lives. They showed how it is that the future was just months away, or certainly a year away. They were the prototype of how we could get it done, solve the problem, the NBA. Not going to remember that. That's the reality. And so that's the reason it gets to be so frustrating. When, we have all these issues with regard to race and such that I think really do matter. And we have all this potential for potential solutions, like I just talked about with regard to the NBA, but we get caught up on cancel culture. People that just want to cancel people, criticize people, or have what I described in the prior YouTube video as offendophilia. And here's just some examples of comics where they're talking about, cancel culture. And if you notice, many of these people being interviewed and such, black comics. Now, I know at this point, most all of you are probably saying, well, some of this stuff I'm agreeing with, but a lot of it, I don't agree with that at all. I really want to hate this guy, but he seems to be bouncing back and forth from one side to the other. Can't quite decide what to do. Make it easy for you, folks. I don't consider myself a progressive. Don't consider myself conservative. I consider myself a libertarian. And if it makes it easy, everybody hates libertarians. So if you want to hate me for that reason, that's fine. Here's a whole series of articles you can read about how it is. Why does everybody hate libertarians? Everybody hates libertarians. Why is libertarianism such a target? Climate change and the strange death of libertarianism. What's wrong with libertarianism? Myths about libertarians. Okay? So I am giving you permission to hate me because of my ideology. Okay, finally, I'm going to be talking about a topic for which I absolutely am not objective. So again, trigger warning. And that's the matter of Hazel Scott and Standup. Hazel Scott. Okay, in 1955, Rosa Parks refused to give up her bus seat to a white man, and we all know the story. 1954, a year before, 9 months before, Claudette Colvin did a similar thing. And as interesting as the story is about Rosa Parks, for those of you that don't know the story, look up Claudette Colvin. To me, I think it's maybe even more of an interesting story. So very interesting. So we've heard of Rosa Parks. We've also heard of Billie Holiday and Sarah Vaughan and Ella Fitzgerald and Lena Horne. We've heard of these folks. But how many people have heard of Hazel Scott? How many people have heard of Hazel Scott? Should have. Hazel Scott was the first black American woman to host her own television show. How landmark is that? She was a piano prodigy, Juilliard trained in classical music and jazz. Who was in her band? Charlie Mingus? Are you kidding me? Rudy Nichols on drums. You can still see on the internet, Foggy Day. She refused to perform in segregated venues. She said, I'm not performing in those areas. So, I mean, you talk about putting your money where your mouth is. She didn't just talk the talk, she walked the walk, folks. Hazel Scott. Yet, how many of you have heard of Hazel Scott? Then, she had final cut privileges in her contract with regard to movies, where she fought Hollywood regarding how blacks were portrayed in films. She believed that blacks shouldn't just be portrayed as being poor and desolate in the films that she was in. And she says, if you're going to put that in there, then you're going to have to cut it out because I have final cut privileges and I'm not allowing that. Now, you would think somebody with that kind of a history, first black woman to host her own television show, prodigy in jazz and classical music, a champion of civil rights that didn't just get the headlines, but in fact, probably made it very difficult for herself to put these sort of demands out there with regard to how, where she was going to perform, how she was going to perform, and how the movies were going to portray the folks in the movies for which she was an actor. So why haven't you heard Hazel Scott? Well, here's a copy. I think that I got it off the internet. I think this is accurate. I don't think it's made up. But in 1950, folks, I want you to remember this. This is, at the time of this videotaping, this is 70 years ago, okay? There was a hearing on the Committee of Un-American Activities, House of Representatives, 1950. And she was testifying. And she had to testify because she was being accused of being a communist sympathizer. So it wasn't about race, okay? It was about her beliefs. So here is part of her, part of her testimony. Certain citizens have deliberately turned their backs on procedures for which we are accustomed to and have set themselves up as private judges and tribunals to assess and convict their fellow citizens. Whoa! I mean, what does that sound like? I mean, doesn't that sound like certain individuals in cancel culture today? Where it doesn't matter about due process, we think you're guilty, so you're guilty. This is Hazel Scott, black woman, 1950. I do not claim that the members of the entertainment world are holier, purer, or more patriotic than any other group of citizens. We probably have our quota of dissidents, our quota of communists, bigots, and fascists. Now, at this point, if I had to advise Hazel Scott, I might have suggested that she, many times when I write emails, and if it's going to be on a controversial thing, I will write it one day, and then I will put it aside, and I'll read it the next day, and then I will probably alter it. I just think proofreading would have been helpful for Ms. Scott. Okay, think about this. 1950? You can't say this stuff now. What made Hazel Scott think she could get away with this in 1950? Talking about the entertainment industry, we probably have our quota of dissidents, our quota of communists, bigots, and fascists. What would happen? She would be crushed today. This was 70 years ago. And what was she accused of doing? Well, there were 9 organizations that considered subversive. She had this affiliation with these 9 organizations for which she was being accused of subversiveness. And one, she appeared because her employer asked that she do so as a benefit. Another one, she did another benefit for orphan children. Another one this organization was 3 years after she played and did a benefit. Okay, the group later merged with the one that developed the bad name, so she wasn't even involved. The fourth listing advertised that I was a guest of honor at a dinner that she never went to. she never attended the dinner, never heard of the organization. 3 others, she didn't even join them. And 2 others, she never heard of them. So each and every one of these accusations about her being a communist sympathizer was based upon nothing. She had no due process, and now she's in front of Congress being vilified as a communist sympathizer. And then the last statement. And before I go over the last statement the last statement I'm going to quote from this congressional hearing, there's this thing sometimes that people do. Here's Barack Obama. When you make a big point and you pick up the mic, you just drop it because it's all that needs to be said. Nothing more needs to be said. You just drop the mic. That's the expression, isn't it? Drop the mic. Here's the mic dropper from Hazel Scott. Again, I wish I'd had the opportunity to advise Ms. Scott because, again, I just think proofreading might have been helpful. Okay, proofreading, because again, it's 1950. Furthermore, I will maintain my fight for the application of our liberties to all, regardless of color and creed. Those of the far left and far right have no place in this fight. The latter have no respect for liberty, nor do the former, although they mouth the slogans. Hazel, what are you doing? You can't say this now. You couldn't say that now. No, you can't say that now. And you certainly couldn't have said that in 1950. So what happened after her congressional testimony? Hazel's speech made the headlines. A week later, her talk show was canceled. She was canceled. There's an instance of cancel culture in the flesh. Hazel Scott was a pioneering jazz pianist, first black to own her own TV network show. But when she stood up against racial segregation and stereotyping, the industry blacklisted her, and her name was all but erased from the history books. Brings me to this. Folks, where do we turn? Where do we go? Let's say that you are a voter and I'm not saying you should be this way. I'm just saying, this is just an illustrative example. Let's say you're pro or you're for freedom and opportunity, for inclusion and tolerance. You're for humanity and forgiveness. You're for fiscal responsibility, and you're for evidence-based solutions in work. And let's say you oppose bias and discrimination. You oppose violence and war. You oppose politics and name-calling. You oppose corruption and wasteful spending. And you oppose indifference and talk. Which political party do you join? Not only all of them. I mean, there's no party that's going to be 100% what a voter would want. But just pick any one of these. Which is the better political party? Fiscal responsibility. You're going to pick a Republican? Are Republicans truly more fiscally responsible than Democrats? I don't think so. It's not what the evidence would suggest. Bias and discrimination. Do you think Democrats are more tolerant to opposing points of view than Republicans? See, I don't know. Which is why I believe we should have Hazel Scott Day and honor the freedom of speech and association. It should be October 1st of every year. October 1st, because that's when she died. And we ought to implement Hazel Scott rules, which are guidelines for addressing accusations of wrongdoing. First, you ought to, if you're accusing somebody of doing something wrong, then you need to specify and detail the accusations, which is akin to the Sixth Amendment right to face the accuser. Too many times I see leaders of large businesses that will make these, self-aggrandizement. They just want to look at themselves, and people call it virtue signaling, whatever. And they will stand out and rail against something. They don't even know what they're talking about. They have no specific reason to object to what they're objecting to because they don't know what it is. They don't know the issues. Second, follow objective procedures to verify the accusations. Folks, you can't just accuse somebody and then have social media go crazy, then have them canceled. There's got to be due process. Consider the time period since the accusation supposedly took place. We're going to talk about that. I think if it happened over 10 years ago, something happened over 10 years ago, I think we need to be very careful about that. If accusations prove to be false, then publicize the exoneration at least to the degree as coverage of the false accusation. Here we got Hazel Scott. How many of you have heard of Hazel Scott? How come she hasn't been exonerated? How come there haven't been movies about her? Have you thought about that? And finally, those who falsely accuse others should be held accountable. Right? If you falsely accuse somebody of something, you need to be held as accountable of the people you accuse. All right, so how does this apply to comedy in general? Well, look, as I said before, cancel culture has existed for centuries. I'm going to be talking about that, but one of the top two comics in my rating system, one would be Dave Chappelle, who's listed here, and the other would be George Carlin, but Dave Chappelle's black, so that's the reason I'm mentioning it here. Look at his discussion about cancel culture in 2019. And the issue is there are a lot of movies, art, and such that we grew up with. No way it gets released today. I mean, it just doesn't. Gone with the Wind, can you imagine Gone with the Wind being made today? No, that movie does not get released. Blazing Saddles does not get released. Bad News Bears, Animal House, Life of Brian, The Jerk, Caddyshack does not get released. Malcolm X, sorry to tell you folks, Malcolm X, tremendous movie. You know, other than, John Adams, I really like that movie. I think it was historically accurate, but Malcolm X, right up there as sort of a drama, but also a documentary. That does not get released today. Watch the movie again, and you make your judgment. A whole lot of reasons that I don't want to talk about, but it doesn't get released. Certain music videos or music today, Once in a Lifetime by the Talking Heads. No, that does not get released. Watch it. See if you can figure out why. Tusk by Fleetwood Mac. No way does that get released today. And then finally, Monty Python. No, none of Monty Python gets released today. Okay? So this is a slide that will be in a future video talking about forgiveness. Judging yesterday's opinions and commentary by today's standards is ignorant, arrogant, lazy, and demonstrates a stunning lack of understanding for the potential of evolutionary change. Folks, judging people yesterday by today's standards is, again, it's just lazy. It's just lazy. I mean, we can look back at Lenny Bruce, famous comic. I can't say that he made me laugh all that much, but I do acknowledge his historic importance. Lenny Bruce is a comic who used to claim that I'm not a comedian, I am Lenny Bruce. He says, I am not sick, the world is sick, and I am the doctor. He was blacklisted and found guilty of obscenity in New York City in 1964. Now, a lot of people said because he used a lot of blue language. Folks, a lot of people were using blue language. A lot of people still use blue language. So what is it that got Lenny Bruce blacklisted? Well, I would encourage you to go to the website for a video of his transcript performance, and it's very sad. He's got an entire routine where he stands up there and he's reading his court transcripts. And you got these sycophants out there in the audience, and they're laughing, but there's nothing to laugh at. Okay, but they want to show their hip, I guess, and laugh at what Lenny Bruce is telling them, but it's just very sad. You can see he's just descending into this, just descending into a very bad place. And so if it wasn't language, what is it that he did that, suddenly got him blacklisted? Well, a big part of what got him blacklisted is the assassination of John F. Kennedy. And one of his bits, he was talking about unrealistic expectations of Jacqueline Kennedy and how it is that the press was going on and on, how brave she was that she was jumping out of the car to kind of get medical help for her husband who just got shot in the head, right? And Lenny Bruce said she wasn't jumping out of the car to get medical help. She was jumping out of the car to to save her ass. And again, the point was not to be critical of Jacqueline Kennedy, but just to simply acknowledge, why do we imprint these unrealistic expectations on our celebrities and such? I mean, this woman just had her husband killed. Do we really have to go there? Okay, so that's where I think he was trying to go with his routine. Well, that was not received very well. Hauled her ass to save her ass. No, that contributed largely to him being blacklisted. Which brings us to the N-word in comedy. On the matter of systemic racism in stand-up, the N-word. So Richard Pryor, many times you hear Richard Pryor being listed as one of the top comics of all time. I didn't care for Richard Pryor as much as other people did as stand-up, because much of his routine that was celebrated was about drug addiction. And I guess because I'm a physician, I've seen the horrors of drug addiction. It's not as funny to me. So that's a bias on my part. But with regard to the N-word, Richard Pryor said, to this day, I wish I never said the word. He's talking about the N-word. I felt its lameness. It was misunderstood by people. They didn't get what I was talking about, neither did I, so I vowed never to say it again. Now, there are a lot of African-American comics that will justify the use of the N-word, and I'll leave that to them. I don't so much mind that they use the N-word, only because whatever fills the dinner pail. Remember George Washington Carver, that I talked about before? This is how folks make their living. So, who am I to judge? Secondly, maybe that's just a down payment of reparations. They're able to use the N-word when nobody else is. Maybe that's part of reparations. I don't know. And then we go back to that comedy opening bit that I talked about, where, where the comic got up and said, "Glad to see you here tonight." This African-American comic, and glad to see you all here tonight. And I guess you're glad to see me on the stage tonight, because that means I'm not in the parking lot stealing your car. As much as I may object to that, the fact is, he's just trying to feed his family, right? He's just trying to make a living. Who am I to judge? Where there may be an issue with the N-word for me, though, is people need to look at history, at what happens to situations like this. So, for example, there's been a banning of certain books that have been erased. To Kill a Mockingbird and Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. So that's been taken off the reading list because it's got the N-word. It's been taken off the reading list for children, for school children, because it contains the N-word. And people all upset. You're it's cancel culture and you're erased. Folks, you know how many books are written per year? Like 1 million. I think that's actually accurate. 1 million. We can't replace these 2 books. I mean, I remember reading them. They were okay. But why would we be outraged that just 2 books get taken off? If it's got the N-word in it, I don't know that children need to be hearing the N-word. Not children. Okay? So if people want to cancel those books or erase those books and replace them with others, I'm sort of fine with that. Okay? But what about, if we do that now with regard to the N-word, what's going to happen 50 to 100 years from now? What will be the norm 50 to 100 years from now? Will it be the same as now? Will everybody be able to say the N-word and it's no big deal? Or will it reflect a practice in time people will want to erase? Will people say, well, I don't want to remember that back then. I just want that erased. And what will be the consequences to today's black comics? What will be the consequences to Dave Chappelle, for example? Will he be erased 15 to 100 years from now because he used the N-word? Don't know. So this is just yet another installment of the science of stand-up. This particular YouTube video, we've been talking about the social sciences. The next YouTube video, we'll be talking about free speech and cancel culture. That would be the second one in the series of social sciences. And then after that will be the third one on forgiveness. Please click on the subscribe button to add this channel to your YouTube TV. Click on the notification bell to be notified of new content. Click on the like button below if you like the video. Click on the share button. To send this video by email or Twitter or Facebook to other folks. And as with the other YouTube videos, here's some questions I would like you to focus upon and comment in the comment section. What was the main reason Hazel Scott was largely erased from history? She was blacklisted as a communist. She stood up to the Hollywood elites. She challenged both political parties. And her narrative transcended race. Like if she was canceled because of race, I bet we would have heard from her. I believe that she still would be part of history if she had been canceled because of race. But because it wasn't race, did that make a difference? Is it because the narrative transcended race? I mean, again, for all you people on the right that want to talk about cancel culture, and we should quit worrying so much about race, should worry about people's thoughts and the content of their character and all that kind of stuff. Where are you when it comes to Hazel Scott? I would think a person like that would be your hero. And 50 to 100 years from now, will current black comics be erased from history because they use the N-word? Don't know. Be unfortunate. Might happen. So thank you. Thank you for watching another installment of the Science of Stand-Up. And hope you'll stay tuned for future YouTube videos.